Welcome to Android 180 Toolbar and App Bar. The first half of the course will look at Toolbar in isolation, and then we'll integrate a toolbar as our Activities app bar. Activities often have a title and a logo at the top just for branding or identifying where in the app the user currently is, and in this first part that's what we're going to use the toolbar for. So toolbar is a class in the library. It has a bunch of different parts in it that you can use or ignore depending on which your activity needs. On the left-hand side there is a navigation button, then there's a logo, title and subtitle, then there's a custom view area so you can add in any view you'd like, and finally there's an actions menu for the most commonly used commands on this activity. There are two implementations of toolbar available. There's the standard one that arrived in API 21, and if you need to support previous versions of Android, you can use the support library version. In this course, we are going to go ahead and use the support version. The support toolbar has a dependency on the app compat theme, so you need to select one of those for your application. If you don't, you'll get an exception when you try to create a toolbar. Here's the XML to actually create a toolbar instance. Notice we're using the support version, so of course we have the namespace name on the front. There's one tricky thing that you need to know about when using the support version of the toolbar. Since it comes to you from a library rather than standard Android, the attributes that toolbar defines are not in the standard Android namespace. So this code right here won't work if you use the Android prefix to set the title. That'll be ignored at runtime. Instead, what you need to do is create an XML prefix for your app's namespace. And you do that using the special symbol resauto. The Android build tools automatically replace that with your app's package name. Most people use the prefix app by convention. It's not required, but you probably should. It's extremely common. Now that we have that prefix defined, we use it to access the toolbar attributes. Here's our goal then. We create a toolbar, we set logo, title, and subtitle. Here's the app we're going to use to demonstrate toolbar. This is the starter code, so currently there's no toolbar anywhere here. The app has 3 activities. This is the main activity that lists several hard-coded recipes. I'm going to select one of them. That navigates me to the details activity. There's an about button here. If I tap that, I go to the about activity, and then back here to details. The top part of this activity is where we're going to do all our work. All these controls at the top are going to be relocated over the course here into a toolbar. So I have an icon, I have some text that lists the name of the recipe, and then I have a favorite button here. If I tap that, you can see the image toggles. And if I go back to the main activity, since that recipe is now a favorite, it has an asterisk next to its name. Back to details here, I have 1, 2, and 4. Those are the number of servings that I'm trying to do. And if I click on 2, you can see the numbers down here change. And finally, there's a back button right here. I know that's a little redundant because Android has a back button, but I do want to demonstrate navigation with the toolbar, and this is a really simple way to do it. And if I tap that, I go back to the main activity. Our goal right now is to replace the image view and the text view that's displaying the logo and title with the toolbar. So here I am in the details layout file. I'm going to add a toolbar to this activity, and then I'm going to set the logo here in XML. So here it is, app::logo. Notice I'm using the app prefix, which is defined right up here using resauto. This is all I'm going to set in XML. I'm not going to set the title here. The title is going to be dynamic. It's going to be the name of the current recipe. So instead of setting it here in XML, I'm going to put an ID on the toolbar. And then in my code behind here, detailsActivity.cs, in my onCreate method, I'm going to look up the toolbar. So find view by ID with the ID right there. And then I'm going to set the toolbar title to the name of the current recipe. And when I run this, start at the main activity, navigate to details. At the top here, of course, it doesn't look much different, but this is now a toolbar instance. The image right here is that logo we set in XML, and then the text is the name of the recipe that we set in code. The next thing we're going to talk about is how to implement a menu. And this is a pretty common scenario. Most activities have an area there at the top of their UI for the most commonly used commands. These commands actually have a special name. They're called actions. So you have to decide which commands in your activity are the ones that are either the most frequently used, the most important, or typical, meaning they occur in many common user workflows. So any commands that fit that category qualifies to be what's called an action, and therefore should occupy this menu area within your activity. The toolbar is set up to do this for you. It has a built-in area called the Actions menu. And there's two parts. There's those items that are visible, and then those three dots there represent the overflow area for things that are either slightly less important or don't fit in the visible area. Each of those entries on the Actions menu behind the scenes is represented by one of these things, an I menu item. And this is actually kind of important to know about if you ever have to manipulate the menu items dynamically, or if you want to build your menu dynamically. Inside here, there's a few common things. There's a title, that's the piece of text that would get displayed on the menu item or as its tooltip. Then there's the icon, which is the image that you see on the menu. Its positioning, whether it's visible or in the overflow area. Whether it has a submenu, we'll see how that works later. And finally, its check state. That's another thing we'll talk about in the next section. Each entry has an icon, as I mentioned. You can use one of the Google icons there, or of course you can create your own. There's a link to some guidelines if you do decide to do it yourself. For each item, you have to decide whether it's worthy of going in the visible area, in which case you would say, please always show this item, or if it's only important enough to be shown when there's room. For example, if the user has the device in landscape mode, there's more room and you can fit more icons, but if they're in portrait mode, there's less room, so these secondary or slightly less important actions should then be relegated to the overflow area. And finally, there's some things that should always go in the overflow area. For example, help or feedback or about links are not generally thought to be important enough to be displayed directly on the toolbar and should always go in the overflow area. What the user sees depends on where the item is being displayed. If it's directly on the toolbar, so it's visible, then all their user is going to see is the icon. If they do a long press on the icon, the title will pop up as a tooltip. Things in the overflow area only show the title, so you're not going to see the icon in that case. There's two ways to build these menus. You can do it either in code, which is useful in some cases where the entries need to be dynamic, or you can do it in XML, which is more common. We'll look at both, but we'll spend the majority of our time on the XML case. Here's how to do it in code. You start by calling the add method. So you look up your toolbar, you go to its menu, and then call add. That does a couple of things. It adds a new entry to the menu. It also sets the title. See how you pass in resource.string.whatever, and it returns back to you an iMenuItem reference, which you then can use to set any of the other properties that you need. So in this case, I'm setting the image and then determining where this thing goes. In this case, I say if room, which means if there is room available, show it directly on the toolbar. If not, put it in the overflow area. So that show as action enum right there has three values: always, if room, and never, the three cases we already looked at. So the XML case is more common. To create a menu in XML, you use what's called a menu file. So you create a new XML file, and the root of it's going to be this menu node. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. This is going to go in your resources section, so you're going to make a new subfolder called menu, and then put this XML file inside it. And then in code behind, you're going to look up your toolbar and call this inflate menu method and pass in the resource identifier for the XML file containing the menu definition. So again, as I said, you start with the menu as the root node, and then inside that you can have individual items or groups of items. We'll talk more about group in the next section, but have to start with a menu, and then again, either single or groups of items. The root node menu doesn't really have very many attributes to set. It's really just the place that you can define your XML namespaces. You'll typically need the Android standard namespace. If you're using the support version of the toolbar, you're also going to need this resauto prefix. So now we have our menu file structure defined. Inside the menu item, we're going to add these item nodes, and we're going to set things like title, that's the string, icon, and then the positioning, show as action. Notice the use there of the app prefix for the Show as Action attribute that is required if you're using the support toolbar. Typically, you're going to want to subscribe to a click handler on your toolbar and get notified when the user selects one of the menu entries. Behind the scenes then, as you respond to user taps, you're going to need to identify which item on the menu was clicked. To do that, you set an ID on every item in the toolbar that you need to identify from code behind. And here we are behind the scenes. We look up our toolbar, we subscribe to the menu item click event. We get a menu item click event args parameter, and we look inside that at the item. And in this case, we're looking at the item ID, of course. If I go back to the last slide here, see how I have ID equal add to favorites? So that's going to show up here as the item ID. That's the way we identify and then respond to the item that was clicked. Let's look at some code now. Here I have an actions menu. Notice I've named the file actions.xml, and I've stored it in the menu folder under my resources. It of course starts with a menu node, and inside the menu node I define my two namespaces. The first one's the standard Android one, and the second one is the res auto mapping that I need because I'm using the support toolbar. My first item here is add to favorites. I set an ID so I can access it from code behind, and then I have a title and then show as action always. That means it's going to be displayed directly on the toolbar. Notice that I don't set any image here, and if you go over here to look at the running app, you can see that there is an image. So I'm setting that image from code behind. I'm setting it at startup, and then every time the user taps on that menu entry, I'm toggling the image from the outline to the filled in version. The second one is about, and here again you can see I don't have an image, I just set the title. This one I'm displaying in the overflow area and it doesn't need an image there. So if I tap on the overflow area, the about entry pops up there. Let's look at the code behind. So here's the first thing I do, of course, find view by ID to look up the toolbar, and then I call inflate menu. That's a method that's coming to us from the toolbar, and I pass in the resource identifier for that XML file. Then I subscribe to the click event, scroll down and look at the handler. So here's the handler. I get a menu item click event args, and inside there's a property called item, and that's an iMenu item reference. And one of the properties of that, of course, is the item ID, so I can identify when the user taps on add to favorites. And in that case, I toggle my behind the scenes data store just to record the fact that this recipe is now or is not a favorite. And then here, this method is where I toggle the image on the button. That's a little bit interesting, so let me show you that. Here's the method. I go back to the toolbar, to the menu part of the toolbar, that's the actions menu, and it has a find item method that takes an ID. So I look up the add to favorites entry, and then I call set icon on it, and I'm just toggling between the filled in heart and the heart that's just the border. And then the final thing here is just the about case. When they tap on the about entry in the overflow area, I just navigate to the about activity. And now that we've seen the basics of XML menu files, we're going to look at two other features that you can do with menus. The first one is hierarchy. That is, you can have a top-level entry that opens a submenu. And the second one is groups of items and checkability. So you can make lists of checkboxes or radio buttons. So let's start with hierarchy. So for example, here you have an entry on your actions menu, and when the user taps that entry, you might want to have a submenu pop up. So that's our first goal here. The way you do this is with a submenu. So here I have a menu. So this would be up here, my top level menu entry. Inside that, I have an item. So now each item can itself have either 0 or 1 nested submenus. So in this case, I have a submenu. The pop-up nature is automatic. So when the user selects that top item, that menu appears automatically. And it is, by the way, light dismiss. So if the user selects an item within the submenu disappears, or if they tap outside of the submenu, it disappears. So making a submenu is pretty simple. The next thing is groups and checkability. So here's our goal. Here I have a submenu, and in this case I have radio buttons. So when they tap, the user taps this, submenu pops up, and then they select from one of these two options. Notice these, in this case, these two would be mutually exclusive, so we chose to use radio buttons for it. But you can also do checkboxes if you'd like. And the key to getting these things is using a group. So a group is a container, but it's also the sort of unit of checkability. So here I have a group and then several items inside it. The group element is the thing that gives you the checkable behavior. So there's an attribute here and you have 3 choices. Single means one at a time, which is radio buttons. All means they're not mutually exclusive, so you get checkboxes. And this UI over here, the radio buttons and the checkboxes, that's all built for you automatically. And then the default is none. All right, so this would just be a grouped submenu with no checkable behavior at all. The only tricky part of all this really is the handling click events. And there's 2 cases and they're slightly different. Let's do the radio button case first. So suppose I have this menu right here, and let's assume neither of them are checked to begin with. And the user taps on this first one, like. The radio button here does not get checked automatically. You can see visibly it looks like it's now set, right? That doesn't happen automatically. You have to write code to do that. So here I am in the code behind. When they tap on like, I set the checked state of the like button to true. The tricky part is I do not have to clear all the other ones. These do automatically function as radio buttons. So when you check one of them, all the others in the group automatically get unchecked. The checkbox case is slightly different. There's no automatic unchecking of the other elements, which makes sense because these are things where you might want to have any combination of them checked at the same time. So in this case, when the user taps on one of these, you don't get the check automatically. You do have to write some code. And here behind the scenes, I just toggle the state. So here e.item.is checked, so I test whether the item is already checked, right? Have a not on that and just use that as the new checked state. So I'm manually toggling these on and off as the user taps them. Let's look at an app now. Here I have the solution for the exercise for this part. The new piece that we're looking at is right here. So I have a new entry on our toolbar. That's the number of servings, and I chose the multiple person icon there. When I tap on that top level thing, I get this submenu pop up. Notice that I have pre-selected the 1 serving button. So this did not happen automatically. I had to set the checked state for this first one to true in order to have this happen at startup. For each of these entries, I just have text. I chose not to use an image there. And I chose radio buttons because these are mutually exclusive. You would not simultaneously create 2 servings and 4 servings of the same recipe. If I select one of the items here, you can see that the UI updates, and if I go back to the menu, the checked state has updated. So behind the scenes, I'm writing code to set the checked state of this one to true. I did not have to clear this one. That happened automatically. And again, it is light dismiss, so if I tap outside the menu, it will go away. Let's build up the code to make that happen. We'll start here in the actions.xml file. So this is the menu definition file. Currently we have 2 items. The first thing we're going to do is add a new item. Notice this is the people icon, so this is the multiple people. This is the one that's going to display the submenu. And I've chosen show as action always, so it's displayed directly on the toolbar. Inside here, I'm going to add a submenu. So just nesting a menu inside an item creates a submenu. Inside that, I'm going to have a group. And I've chosen radio buttons, so checkable behavior is single. And then inside here, I'm going to have 3 entries, 1 serving, 2 servings, and 4 servings. And here's the setting of the checked state of the first element to true, so that at startup, that first radio button will be set. Here we are in the code behind. The only thing we have to do here is add some cases for the new submenu item. So I have 1, 2, and 4. So I'm going to add 3 cases here. Use the IDs for those nested submenu items, 1, 2, and 4. I update my UI here, so set servings, right? That's the method that just recalculates the amount of all the ingredients in the recipes. And then here's the key thing though, I set the checked state to true of the item that the user tapped. Notice that these are radio buttons, so I do not need to clear any of the others. That happens automatically. Now we've finished our discussion of toolbar by itself, and we're going to switch to talk about using a toolbar as your activities app bar. And some of this first discussion will seem a little bit redundant, but we're just talking here about the pure concept of an app bar, and we'll see in a moment how toolbar fits into that story. The goal here is to make your users happy, make them feel comfortable quickly with your app by putting the standard things that they expect in the standard location. So if you've been working with Android for a while, you've probably seen the top bar across activities that looks something like this, where you have a navigation icon on the left-hand side, then a title, and then a menu on the right-hand side. So the goal is standardization. Users should quickly feel comfortable with your app because the controls that you offer are in the positions they expect. Those standard controls go in what's called your app bar, right? Your application bar. So it's a dedicated spot, goes at the top of your activity, and it hosts all these standard elements we just discussed. And the standardization does come from Google. They have some guidance on how to arrange and style the elements inside your app bar. And again, of course, we've been using Toolbar, so this all looks pretty obvious and familiar. That's just because Toolbar implements these guidelines itself. Here's a historical note. The app bar used to be called Action Bar. And a lot of the old API names are still around. So you'll see methods like this, get action bar and set action bar. There was some confusion. There was the concept of action bar, which was that top strip across your activity. But there was also a class named action bar that implemented the concept of action bar. So even though today we call this app bar, it's important to know a little bit of the history and also about the action bar class, because you'll see it in the API names and some of the return types from some of the APIs. And also a lot of the themes that are still around automatically include an action bar object inside your activity. So here's the starter project from Xamarin Android at the moment. It adds an app bar here implemented as an action bar and automatically uses the activity label there as the title. These days though, it's not very common to use action bar anymore. The capabilities of the action bar class change over time, which means that the version that you use may have different features, so it's hard to get a uniform experience. You could use the standard toolbar, but remember that was added to Android at API level 21, so if you need to support older versions, that won't work. So the current guidance is to use the support version of toolbar, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to create a toolbar instance and install that as our activities app bar. To use the support toolbar as our app bar, we need to change our activities base class. So this is a little bit tricky. So the standard activity class does have these methods here, set support action bar, support action bar. Notice that this one takes a toolbar. The regular activity base class will allow you to use a toolbar as your app bar. However, these were only added to the activity base class in API level 21, which means if you're trying to target API versions earlier than that, you won't have these methods available. So the standard guidance is to switch your activity-based class to app compat activity. That way you'll get these methods and be able to support all the way back through API level 9. Let's look more closely at these methods. The first one's sort of obvious, set support action bar. The name maybe is a little bit funny because it says action bar instead of app bar, but the idea is pretty simple. This is the way you install a toolbar object as your activities app bar, and we'll see what that means in just a moment. The second one is kind of interesting as well here, support action bar property. So you have a getter there that returns an action bar. So this is an action bar wrapper around the toolbar. So if you call set support action bar and pass your toolbar here, and then you use this property, you'll get back that same toolbar, but it will be one level in. It'll be wrapped inside an action bar object. And that's just for compatibility with other APIs, like older APIs that were written before toolbar existed, when app bar was implemented using action bar. Once you install a toolbar as your app bar, the way you work with it changes. What we were doing before to inflate our actions menu, we called the inflate method on the toolbar. Now we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to override an activity method here. To handle item click events, Remember, we were subscribing to the menu item click event on the toolbar. We're not going to do that anymore. Instead, we're going to override an activity. The navigation icon we're going to talk about in the next part, so we haven't seen this yet, but that changes as well. You would set it with an XML attribute if you're using a toolbar by itself, and use action bar methods if you're installing a toolbar as your app bar. So with all that background, that we can lay out the steps. This is pretty mechanical, actually. So first, you switch all your activities to this different base class. Then remember that a lot of the standard themes install an action bar object as your app bar, and you don't want that. So you need to use a theme that doesn't have an automatic app bar installation. And then create and position a toolbar instance. Install that toolbar as your app bar, populate the actions menu, and then respond to click events. Remember, the way we respond now is going to be different. So let's look at each one of these steps. First one is really straightforward. All your activities just switch to this base class right here. Second is also pretty straightforward. Choose one of the themes that does not install an action bar by default. Create a toolbar object. It is your responsibility to position it in the standard location at the top of your UI. Here's the call to set support action bar. So here I am in my activity. I'm inside on create. Notice I inherit from app compat activity. Because I inherit from app compat activity, I now have this method right here, set support action bar, available to me, and I pass in my toolbar object. That installs the toolbar as this activity's app bar. As soon as I do that now, the way I work with that toolbar changes. Here's the first case. So instead of calling inflate directly on the toolbar, we instead override this activity method. And this is just a regular old activity method. This isn't anything special from app compat activity. So we override on create options menu. Instead of calling inflate directly on the toolbar instance, we use this menu inflator here. And this is the XML file identifier right here. And we automatically get handed the menu that is our actions menu within our toolbar. And the last step is how we handle click events. So this is also different. Now, instead of subscribing directly to the toolbar event, we override this activity method. And this is another regular activity method. This is not special to app compat activity. On options item selected. Remember, the actions menu is suddenly now called the options menu. So this is basically the callback when the user taps on any item in the actions menu. You get an iMenu item. We've seen that several times now. And inside there, we have an ID, so we can determine which item was tapped. As a reminder, here are the steps that we're going to look at in the code. Everything except number 3 we'll go through in detail. That one hasn't changed from the last time we looked at the code, but the other 5 we'll do right now. Here we are in our example code. Currently, our base class is the standard activity. We're going to use a support toolbar, though, as our app bar, so we need to change that to use the support app compat activity. Because now we inherit from app compat activity, we have access to this method right here. This is coming from our base class. Obviously, you don't need the base there. It's just to emphasize the fact that it's coming from app compat activity. This is the method that we inherit that takes a toolbar. So this is the one that lets us use a toolbar as our app bar. Now that we're using a toolbar, the other interaction patterns change. The way we populate the actions menu and the way we respond to click events. Here's the way we populate it. We override on create options menu. And then instead of calling the toolbar inflate method, we call a inflate method on this inherited menu inflator. And there's a little bit of other boilerplate code there. This is just our initialization to make sure that we get the heart symbol, either the outline or the filled in one, based on whether or not this recipe is a favorite. So that's creating the menu. The last thing is responding to click events. To do that, we override this activity method on options item selected. And the change here, when we did this with the toolbar itself, we got some sort of event args, and we had to look inside the event args to get the iMenu item. Now we get that directly. So our switch statement will look just a little bit different. Switch item ID, but other than that, the cases in here, the logic and stuff is going to be the same as what we had before. And then the last step is to set our application theme to one of those that do not use an action bar. And also remember, of course, we want one of the app compat themes because the support toolbar depends on that. The last thing we're going to do is use the toolbar's ability to display a navigation button. The navigation button goes in this standard spot in the upper left corner. In this screenshot here, we're using it for a drawer navigation, so tapping on that button will open up a sliding drawer. This also gets used a lot for up navigation. We're going to use it for back navigation, which isn't as common because you often don't need it. Android has a standard back button, but it'll let us look at all the mechanics of how to do this in a really simple way. There's two methods you need to know about to do this, and these come from Action Bar. So notice they're not from Toolbar, they're from Action Bar, but that's not a problem. If you load a toolbar as your Action Bar and then retrieve it, you're going to get an Action Bar wrapper around your toolbar, so you will have access to both of these methods. The first one enables the button, and the second one lets you choose what symbol, what icon you want to display on the button. Notice the name up appears in both methods. That was the original intent of this idea for up navigation, but since then it's become more generalized, so you do see this used a lot. There's only 3 steps we need to do. Call the method to enable navigation, choose an icon, and then respond when the user taps on the navigation button. Here's the first one. So we're just in on create. Notice how we're calling here support action bar property. So that's using the getter of that property. That gives us back an action bar, which is going to be a wrapper around our toolbar. Since we now have an action bar, we can call set display home as up enabled. So that enables the button. Next one, it's the same pattern, support action bar. This time we choose which icon we want. In this case, IC menu white is going to give us that classic hamburger icon with the 3 horizontal bars. And finally, respond to click events. This is part of your toolbar, and your toolbar is now set as your app bar. So you respond to click events using the on options item selected method. Really, the only trick here is the ID. So the navigation button has a special resource identifier. Notice that says android.resource.id. So you just check the item ID for home. If you find it, you know the user tapped on the navigation button, and then inside that if statement, you navigate. You either open the sliding drawer, you navigate to your parent activity if you're doing up navigation, or maybe call finish on your activity if you're doing back navigation. And let's look at that code inside a real project here. So I'm in my details activity inside on create. I look up my toolbar and then I call set support action bar on the toolbar. The get property there, support action bar again, that returns an action bar wrapped around the toolbar. And if I tried to do this directly, toolbar dot, and then tried to call set display, you can see that it's not there. So it is the getter method here that wraps an action bar around our toolbar and gives us access to these action bar methods. Here's the other one I want to call, set home as up indicator. So we enable the button and then we choose our icon. Next we have to respond to click events, and we do that in on options item selected. So we add a new case here. Notice we use the special symbol home. That's what the navigation button taps yield. And in this case, since we're doing back navigation, we just do finish. When I run this, here's my main activity. Let me navigate to the details activity. In the upper left corner, there's our navigation button. If I tap that, that takes me back to the main activity. And that brings us to the end of Android 180, Toolbar, and App Bar. Thank you very much for watching.